It's a me. It's a me, a Mario. No, not really. It's just me. That's me, Brandy M. Miller. I'm gonna, mute my YouTube so I don't hear my own echo and drive myself crazy. Now that I know for a fact, I am in fact broadcasting. Pop out the chat, put it on the other screen so I can keep talking to you lovely people while I do whatever I do. Which, nobody's really sure what the heck that is. What do you do? I don't know. Why are you asking me for definites and decisiveness? I don't have any answers around this place. No, that's Real Talk. Welcome to the second edition of Real Talk. And that's just what it's going to be. It's real talk about real things going on in real life. I don't have an agenda, so I'm just going to talk. And if you find it interesting, that's fantastic. And if not, at least I've had my piece. So this week has been, this week has been quite a bit of me recovering from being sick and working through those issues, working on the book that I'm going to send to the publisher. I'm hoping to finish it by the end of this month. I've got a book to edit that I still need to work on for a client of mine. And then I've also been working on putting up my Etsy store and setting up Spoonflower and Zazzle with some of my art, and really starting to get to work on being a better steward of my gifts and my skills and my abilities. Because one of the things that I realized over this last year is that I have a lot of gifts, talents, and skills. In fact, it's sometimes easier to ask me what I don't do than it is to categorize what I do. Because I just have such a wide variety of interests. And so it's one of the reasons why I decided to turn the channel into basically a creative arts retreat and rehabilitation center. Is I didn't want to be pigeonholed in my interests, because that's not who I am. I'm not a spellished? I'm not that either, whatever that happens to be. I'm not a specialist. In fact, one of the things that happened to me when I was younger, during a retreat for women, it was after the retreat, about 6 weeks after, and we were discerning our roles for the giving side of the retreat. The first set of the retreat was you receiving the retreat and enjoying that process. And the second side was giving back. Because gratitude is such an important part of mental health that gets overlooked. When you can take stock of what you've been given and really appreciate it, and then work to give that back to somebody else, it is such a boost to the self-esteem, to your mental health, to your feeling of being worthwhile, of doing something that matters with your life. And so we were discerning what role we were supposed to play. And I started out thinking that I knew exactly the role that I was going to try for. I had prayed over it. I thought for sure this one was for me. And I get up to discern for that role, and there's probably about 6 of us that discerned for the role at first. And, round after round, everybody else is sitting down, and it's just me and this one other lady left. And at that point in time, I heard God ask me, will you give this up for my sake? And of course, my response was, sure, of course. The only reason I wanted is for your sake. But then that left me with quite the conundrum, which was, okay, now what? I've given this up for you. You wanted her in that role instead. What's my role supposed to be now? And role after role came up, and I could have easily stepped into any of them, but every time it was not this one, not this one, not this one. Somebody else was better suited for it. And I was starting to feel like maybe there just wasn't a role for me. And then came the role where nobody else was going to do the role. Nobody stood when the role was called. And it was a role that was perfect for me. It was exactly within my wheelhouse and fit my background and my history to a perfection. And I realized in that moment, and this is so hard for those of us with multiple skills, because we often get told, we often get taunted with, jack of all trades, master of none. And so it can feel very diminishing when you're the multi-talented individual. Like, you don't have a specific role to play. But what I realized in that moment that God was pointing me toward was that I was the fill-in-the-gap person. I was the one who could keep the community going when there wasn't somebody to fill in a role. Because I was so multi-talented and so versatile, I could basically be slid into any particular slot the community needed and do a good enough job that it kept things going. I was not the specialist, so I was never going to be top in my field. But I was good enough that the community could keep going with me in place until the specialist could get there. So I was a bridge that kept the community functioning, which is a very, very important role that not everyone can play. Um, so that was an eye-opener for me, and I think that was one of the first times I realized that so often in life we're trying to figure out what our purpose is, why God made us the way he made us. And it's not until we become part of a community that we can figure that out. In isolation, we don't make sense. If you think of this world as a giant puzzle, a giant jigsaw puzzle, we've all got a part of that puzzle. And some people have an easier time finding their place in life because they're the corner pieces. They're hyper specialized. They may have lots of gifts and talents, but they're all in a specialized direction. There's really nothing else they could be. Like, they're born a virtuoso, and they're just meant to play that role. And so that manifests very early in their life. And they spend their entire life specialized. And then you have the side pieces. Well, that's a little easier to figure out where they belong too. It may take them a little longer, but they've probably got it mastered by their 20s, The rest of us, though, are those crazy, messy centerpieces that you pick up that piece of the puzzle and it's hard to even tell what it is. You don't know where it goes. You don't know which shapes it's supposed to belong to. You kind of got to slide it around on the board until you figure out where it connects. And then once you find where it connects, then you can start building the other pieces around it. And suddenly that little community forms. And now that piece makes perfect sense. And I think not enough people get told this, that finding your place and your purpose is often not going to happen until you've got the right community around you. And then you'll snap into place and it suddenly makes sense. A lot of times your dreams, the things you truly desire in life, are going to point you in the right direction, but not always. Sometimes, you're going to have to figure out, especially if you're multi-talented like I am, you may have a lot of different dreams and they all seem to be going in competing directions. And so you feel a little bit like Stretch Armstrong being pulled away in different directions. And how do you even make sense of that? Eventually you find a way to unify them under one umbrella. Like, for instance, me being a multi-talented individual, it means that I'm a perfect person to run a creative arts retreat and rehabilitation center, because I can speak to almost every area of the creative realm. I've been a writer. I am a writer. I've been a musician. I've played violin and I sing. I've been a theater kid, when I was younger. I loved the theater. Especially when I was in elementary school. I didn't do as much of that as a teenager, although I did do a couple summer performances. I have been in fashion. I have designed fashion since I was a kid. I have been cooking since I was a kid. So there's really not a lot of the creative arts areas where I have not at least had some experience. And I can program and design games, and I, have all these things. So that's kind of what makes me ideal for running the kind of channel that I want to run. And it's probably going to grow slower than a more specialized channel would, because I give YouTube's algorithm trouble. Not all of my audience is interested in any given one thing that I do. So today they may be interested in art. They may not be interested in writing. They may be interested in real talk. They may not be interested in creative arts. So I do give the algorithm a hard time. So one of the things that I've been thinking about doing in order to combat that is to set up more specialized channels and post my content that's related to that on those channels, and use those channels, which are probably going to grow faster than my regular channel. Hey, Malachi! Nice to see you. I'm just talking through channel plans and things like, how I came to this career, how I came to this place in life and what's been going on in my life. So, at any rate, and if you have a particular topic that you would like to talk about, be sure to pop it in chat, because this is real talk. We can talk about anything. I have no taboo topics. I do prefer to keep it clean. So if you ask me to talk about something that I don't think the Lord would approve, we'll discuss why I don't think the Lord would approve of that, and we'll discuss why I wouldn't talk about that too much. I will talk about the why, I just won't talk about the subject. But at any rate, getting back to the thing that I'm thinking is that I'm thinking about creating about 3 specialized channels. One for books and authors, one for art. How did we all get here? Which part? On YouTube, in a crazy mixed up society, on the planet itself? There's a lot of answers to that particular question. But yeah, so I'm thinking of using specialized channels to build big and then direct them to the general channel so that they become basically feeder channels. It's an experiment. I don't know how well it will work. I don't know how much time and energy it will take me to do that, because that is another factor. We have to find a new place to live by the end of next month, and we don't have a steady, reliable source of income. We have kind of sacrificed the ability to get jobs in order to maintain the flexibility required to take care of our granddaughter, which is a sacrifice we're very happy to make. But it also means that we struggle with the financial aspects of things. Our credit is trash and has been since forever. And that's on us. That's our fault. So there's a lot of obstacles in the way, but I serve a God who's bigger than money and bigger than finances. So I'm confident that God is going to help us find a solution that works well for all of us, in a timely manner. Worst case scenario, there is, always going back to Texas. Not my ideal, because I'm really trying very hard to stay near my granddaughter. I didn't grow up with a grandmother, very, very near to me. My dad's parents, my mother cut them off entirely. My dad's dad died when I was 6, and my mom cut my grandmother on that side of the family completely off, because she didn't want my grandmother on that side funneling information to my father, because she felt my father was a threat. And so I didn't have any contact or connection with my father's side of the family until I was in my about 19. And thank you for the thumbs up, Malachi. I totally appreciate that. And then my grandmother on my mom's side was, until I was 10, she was what I would call a Christmas and Easter grandmother, because that's about how often I saw her. Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving. And then she would mail me money for my birthday, and a nice card with some cash in it, which I totally appreciated, but that's how well I knew her until I was 10. And then that spring break, my mother and my grandmother conspired against my grandfather to ship us kids down there. And I spent a week with my grandparents, and I met my grandfather on that side of the family for the very first time. It was actually my step-grandfather, because my actual grandfather on my mom's side died when I was 6 also. So both of my grandfathers were dead by the time I was 6 years old. I I met my dad's dad one time, I think, as a super young kid. I don't even remember it. And I never met my mom's dad. So that was all I knew of my grandmother. And so for that reason, it's been really important to me that me and Jane not have that same situation happen. I don't want her to grow up without a grandmother because I know what it was like to grow up without a feeling of roots, without knowing who your family is or much of anything about them. My mom was, well, my grandmother on my mom's side was quite the trendsetter. She was on her fourth marriage by the time I came along. And for a woman of her generation, that was extremely rare. But, so my mom didn't really know her dad, didn't spend much time with him growing up. He was in and out of the house, in and out of her life, more to the point. That he divorced my grandmother when my mother was 5 and moved in with this German lady he met while he was overseas. So just a really broken, messed up family, and I didn't want that for Mia Jane. I didn't want any part of that. I wanted her to have a firm sense of her family and the confidence of knowing who they were and knowing that she was loved by them and just the support that comes with having family around, which we didn't have when we were raising our son, really. I mean, to a certain degree we did. My mother would babysit, but financially she couldn't help us at all, and the other side of the family who could financially help us usually wouldn't. They didn't really, and it's not, to be fair to them, we were a mess. I mean, both of us were. And not stable mentally or emotionally. And I think they just didn't know what to do with us, is probably a fair assessment. But, so I've made a lot of effort to make sure that Mia has both sets of grandparents in her life to the greatest degree possible, including moving from Texas to Iowa, just to make sure that we stayed with her. And so you knew your grandparents on both sides of the family and you missed them all dearly. They had a huge impact. Yeah, exactly. That's the thing, is that grandparents play such an important role, especially when the dynamic is healthy. Now, grandparents can play the other side of the coin. They can be a very toxic influence if it's not, if they're not healthy, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I do regret, to a certain degree, the fact that I had my son in so much contact with my mother, because I was in pretty deep denial about how unhealthy her behaviors were and how abusive she could be, verbally and sometimes physically, and certainly emotionally. So there's some of that I regret, but at least my son knew who she was and had a chance to make his own decision about her. And as far as my dad went, my son did get some chance to know him before he passed. And not much. We weren't in great contact. I reconnected with him when I was 24. I had to go in search of him. He didn't come looking for me. And he didn't come looking for me because this is a true story. Sort of a sad story, but a true story. My parents met in the psychiatric ward. It's not a joke. That's the story. My dad was a paranoid schizophrenic coming out of Vietnam. My mom was the ward secretary. She knew what he had. She just thought she could fix it. I'm not sure who was crazier, my dad or my mom. My dad had the certification to prove it and was aware that he was crazy, or at least that he'd been labeled crazy. As to whether or not he actually was, that's something that I don't know. One of the things that he would tell you is that he and his fourth wife met on board the alien spaceship that abducted the two of them at age 12. So, yeah, and that they used to dream about each other until they met shortly after he returned to Mississippi after my mom and he divorced. So, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I don't know if that was a delusion. It's also possible that the two of them were both subject to MK Ultra. As crazy as that would sound 10 years ago, with all the files they've released on the government, suddenly it doesn't sound so crazy anymore. Who's to say? My grandmother on that side of the family, when I did get to know her as a young 20s, before she passed away in 2003, she told me that my dad had issues starting at a very young age, but his dad was also a paranoid schizophrenic, and his dad was a paranoid schizophrenic, and his dad was a paranoid schizophrenic. That's kind of what happens when you decide to do your dating at the family reunion, because 3 generations of that family married their first cousin. Not something I would recommend as a strategy for producing healthy offspring. But it does have the advantage that it keeps the property in the family and the money. Except my dad didn't inherit any of that. Our side of the family, on both sides of the family, we came from money. But somewhere along the way, my side, the generations from which I descended, did things that got themselves cut off from the money side of the family. So, for instance, my mother's grandmother, her parents got cut off from the money side of the family on both sides because they were caught behind the barn, not doing anything bad. They were just unchaperoned, so it was assumed that they'd done something and therefore shotgun wedding. He was 17, she was 14. She didn't even know what sex was. She wasn't pregnant until she was, she gave birth shortly after her 15th birthday, I think, or 16th. At any rate, she had to have things explained to her in a hurry. But they got cut off from the money side of the family because of that. She got blotted out of her father's family Bible. The kids weren't even allowed to speak her name after she got married, which is such a tragedy. Such a horrible tragedy. But any rate, and then on my mom's dad's side of the family, yeah, it's so far every Thursday, Saturday afternoon, and Monday. Yes, I'm doing art Mondays, writing on Saturdays, and real talk on Thursdays. I just decided that's a good routine for me. Whoop. Real talk gives me a chance to just talk. Just, do what I love to do naturally, and hopefully, more people show up. So, it's a good way to hang out with friends. I think you just bullshit. I'm good at that. By the way, my initials were BS when I was born. True fact. True fact. I upgraded slightly when I married Randy. It went from BS to BM. Slightly classier version of the same thing. I joked that when you're born with those initials, there's only really 3 occupations that you could be in your lifetime. You're either going to end up being a politician, a con artist, or a writer. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, Malachi. You know, I really do appreciate the time you take to be here. I'm hoping your shoulder's getting better. I know it's got to be killing you. I saw you did something on your channel. I have to go check out the video. Um, but at any rate, so yeah, basically, my family, I come from a long line of crazy. We do it really well in my family. I was going to be a writer, a politician, or a con artist. And I will admit, when I was growing up, I was headed for con artistry. Um, our family, well, let's put it this way. Denial is this really big river that runs through the state of confusion, and we all take a dip in that river from time to time when life just gets to be too much. But it is never wise to go out there and build a houseboat on that thing and live on it. Because the waters of denial hide the crocodile, and I promise that crocodile is just waiting for you to get complacent enough so it can snatch you up and take you under. My family didn't just build a houseboat on that thing. We had an armada. Oh, the level of denial and the amount of deception that was practiced in the family. Your greatest sin was telling the truth. Not, my mother would demand the truth of us, okay? We were raised marginally Catholic. There wouldn't have been enough evidence in our home to convict us, but we went to Mass on Sunday, we went to catechism on Sunday. And that was pretty much where our faith ended, believe it or not. And, but she did insist that we tell the truth to her. But then she was very loose with the truth when it came to other things. My mother's greatest sin as far as lying goes is often that she lies mostly to herself, which is actually not that uncommon. Most of us are uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable with being really honest with each other. I told you last week the story about how, you know, here I am married for 18 years to my husband in a relationship for 18 years with my husband, only to discover that I'd never been fully emotionally transparent with that man. So that meant that I'd really been deceiving him for 18 years. Not a good look. The amazing thing is that he decided to stick it out anyway, which says a lot about his character. So, getting back to my point though, I taught myself to lie, to look my mother and stepfather in the face and lie to them, because the consequences of getting caught doing something wrong, well, there were a couple reasons, okay? I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I wanted my way. I was a very strong-willed child, and I was determined that my way was the best way. That was part of it. But also the other part of it was that consequences for making mistakes were so severe that the last thing I wanted was to be caught making them. So I taught myself to lie. I taught myself to forge my mother's handwriting so that she couldn't choose my schedule for me, but I would forge her signature on the schedule that I wanted. I didn't want her controlling me or dictating terms, so ooh, yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of BS behavior in my family growing up, and I was full of it too, as you might imagine. So it's taken a lot, but you know, one of the things that God told me in the not too distant future, or not too distant past, was when you choose between a lie and the truth, you're not choosing between two things. You're choosing between two saviors. The father of lies or the son of God? Which one do you want? And that has been a very strong deterrent against choosing a lie, even when the consequences for telling the truth are quite high. Which I'm grateful for. Yeah, you forged your mother's handwriting too so you could get out of school early. Yeah, I know the things we kids do. It's kind of, you look back on it and you're like, oh. But yeah, so I was headed to being a con artist in my youth. I fantasized about being a politician in my 20s, but then I realized that anybody who actually wants power is probably the last person you should give it to. Which is why I think our election system is actually pretty messed up. One of the best presidents we ever had was George Washington, and he didn't want the position. In fact, he begged them not to put him in that position. Because when you realize how much responsibility any position of power carries, how much influence you have over the people beneath you, and therefore how accountable you are before God when you lead people astray, even unintentionally, you would think a lot more carefully about wanting positions of influence and power. Because you will be held accountable for everything you've done that led somebody astray. And, I got a lot of atoning to do in that area of my life. Fortunately, I wasn't really well known enough to do massive amounts of damage. But the reality is that it only takes changing one life for the better or the worse to influence the entire course of human history and change its direction. And that's something I think about a lot at age 50. I never would have thought that at age 20 or even age 30. In fact, in 20 and 30, I thought, at age 4, I decided I wanted to be famous because I thought if I was famous, then everybody would love me. And I desperately wanted to be loved. And in my 20s and 30s, even, I really pursued being in the spotlight. And it took God giving me a couple of nudges to kind of tone that down a bit. One of them was, yep. Once you get into MMA and took your religion more seriously, yeah. Well, I don't think you ever stop making amends and atonement for it. It's just that over time, you can mitigate more of the effects. But, there are things I've done that I may never be able to make amends for fully. That's where I have to rely on Jesus. Because if you're relying on yourself, you're not going to be able to fix it. Jesus can fix what you broke. He's the only one who can. But, yeah. Yes, I also cringe at some of the stuff I pulled when I was a kid, man. And even in my 20s and 30s, I'm like, what were you thinking, chick? Where were you headed with that? Like, nowhere. Why were you doing that? I don't even know. Right? But, I would have thought of being a politician, but then, as the more I learn about politics, the more that I understand I do not want to be a politician. No. Especially with all the stuff that's come out recently about what they do to get those positions of power. I do not want that for myself. No. I would likely never have made it because I don't think I was willing to do what a lot of them have done to get there. And I'm glad that I also didn't make it in Hollywood because, when I was little, I desperately wanted to be one of the Disney kids. I desperately wanted to go and be an actress. And my mother told me I was too short to be a model, that they only considered thin, tall women, and I would never be eligible. She also told me she wasn't going to help me become an actress. So my dreams were thwarted, and I'm really glad they were, because now that I know what all went on in Hollywood, I would have been so easy prey because of my background. I'm just really grateful. I know it was God keeping me out of the lion's den. I thought, oh, the money, oh, well, the money comes with a price. And it's definitely one I'm glad that I didn't pay. I had enough prices that I had to pay for the things that happened to me. Uh, and that was apart from Hollywood, so I can only imagine what would have happened if it was in Hollywood. But yeah, so I did the only honorable thing you can do, because con artists, they're illegal because they sell you things that aren't true, but they don't warn you ahead of time. Politicians sell you things that aren't true and never happened, but for some reason, when it's politics, it's legal. They can call it a campaign promise and get away with it. Your science teacher told you students that you should never become a politician, and then he ended up becoming the mayor of your city. Well, maybe he was giving you words of advice, or maybe he just didn't want the competition, to be fair. But yeah, so I became the only honorable thing I could be, which is become a writer, a storyteller. Which, I still tell you things that aren't true and never happened, but I warn you ahead of time because I label it fiction, so you're in on it. I also joke that, writers really are just paranoid schizophrenics that have found a socially acceptable outlet. We just, we write the characters in our heads on the page, the voices in our heads on the page, and as long as we entertain you with them, nobody minds. And yes, some of the voices in my head do want to kill people, and some of them might be serial killers, and as long as I put it on the page and don't take actual action to harm other people with it, it's all kosher. And nobody puts me in the rubber room. Or demands that I take drugs for it. So there's that. Not that I can afford the drugs right now anyway, so. But yeah, my dad, paranoid schizophrenia is such a complex thing. I think there's a lot more to it than we give people credit for. I think maybe they're not crazy. Maybe we make them crazy. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine? One of the things that I love genetics. I love studying genetics. I took 2 years of biology in high school, including AP biology too. And then 2 years of biology in college, or 2 semesters biology in college. I didn't have to. I was an elementary education major, so I didn't have to. But the topic fascinates me. And at the time, I thought I understood genetics pretty well. But really, textbooks do a lousy job. They really do a lousy job of, they basically, genetic determinism is what they teach in college. And that's not really a fair characterization. Your genetics have a lot less to do with who you are than most people realize. It's like your genetics that you get from your parents are a collection of recipes in a cookbook. And the RNA, your mRNA, is assigned by the cell to go into that cookbook and pull out the right recipes to assemble the right proteins to help you handle whatever's going on in your environment. So it assembles signals for hormones, signals for distress, happiness, emotion, all kinds of things. And so, yes, to a certain degree, your genetics play a part in who you become, but a lot less than most people realize. It is mostly the environment that shapes the person. And of course, nurturing plays a large role in that. But I wonder, one of the things they've learned about genetics that is still applicable is that you have at the beginning of your genetic code this long chain of what they used to think was junk DNA. Like it didn't code for any specific proteins that they could find. And so they thought it was junk, or it was leftovers, or it was mutations, that nature basically made mistakes, and that's what that was. And it wasn't until they cloned Dolly the sheep that they figured out what that junk code was for, and it wasn't junk at all. What it is a predetermined maximum length of your lifespan. Every day that you live, a little bit of that code gets chopped off as the cells replicate and replace themselves. And so how they figured that out is they cloned Dolly, and her newborn the newborn kid that was born had all the hallmarks of being a 12-year-old ewe, even though it was a brand new baby lamb. And when they studied the genetics, that's when it hit them. It had all the aging effects that Dolly had. So it didn't inherit all the DNA it should have. And that's when they realized what that part of the code was for. Well, they also originally thought there's a lot of genes that repeat themselves in our code. And they thought that was a mistake. Until they realized, again, with genetic testing and stuff like that, they realized what happens is that the more repeats that you have of a gene, the more reinforced that trait is in you. So, for instance, people who have really dark pigmentation may have 10 or 11 repeats of the gene for melanin production. And, yep, none of the bad genetics. Yep, he's never done anything that we've done as kids. Well, that's good. You know, that when you grow up loved, it fixes a lot of the things that would have been messed up. A lot of the messed up stuff we does. Yeah, that's good English. Welcome to Brandy's School of Gooder English. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying is, love fixes a lot of problems. Getting back to what I was saying, though, so the more repeats you have of a gene, the more emphasized that trait happens to be. So people with really dark skin might have 10 or 11 repeats of the gene for melanin, and somebody with very pale skin might have 1 or 2. And an interesting thing about schizophrenic is that it's very strongly correlated with high intelligence and, yeah, stuff we does. Any rate, glad I can laugh at myself, because if I don't, who will? Any rate, the genes for high intelligence and high creativity are strongly linked with with mental health illness. And that got me thinking that, and one of the things they noticed in schizophrenic patients is that your average person might have 1 to 3 repeats of the gene for creativity. Your more advanced artist might have 4 to 6. Your, really good artist might have 9 to 10. And then somebody like Michelangelo, might have 12 to 15. Well, these schizophrenics, they were all off the charts on creativity. Well, creativity is like an antenna that is set to pick up signals. It helps us connect together bits and pieces of information that don't seem related on the surface, which is how we make, how we get these intuitions and sudden insights that allow us to make life-changing decisions and see things nobody else can. And that's exactly my point. I sometimes wonder if the problem with paranoid schizophrenics and other people who are labeled as crazy isn't that they're crazy at all. It's that maybe they're the only ones seeing color in a world full of people who can only see black and white. And because we don't see it, and we're constantly telling them their experience isn't valid, maybe we're making them crazy. Maybe they don't start out crazy. Maybe we make them crazy. Can you imagine being gaslit your entire life and told that the experiences that you've had are not real? You would start to question your own sanity. You would start to question what is real, what isn't real. It would be very hard to keep your mind straight if that were the case. So sometimes I wonder if, especially gifted people who may be able to see things we don't, hear things we don't, the average person doesn't, or put together patterns that the average person doesn't have the ability to put together, maybe they're not crazy. Or maybe we make them crazy because we're not willing to listen and entertain the idea that maybe there's more to reality than we are capable of comprehending. And, you know, that's kind of like, I don't have the facilities or the financing to go out in there and do a test run of that supposition. So, and I'm not a licensed therapist or psychology major, but, you know, that's my thoughts on it. I could be completely wrong, completely off kilter, but I think it's worth investigating. I think it's worth asking ourselves, is our bias, which is knowledge that we've gained and things that we've been told by society, and he's looking at the snow, by the way. We got snow going on. And all of these things that we have societally been told are true, which may or may not be true. That's what bias does. It can blind us to reality because we don't think it's possible for it to be true, and therefore we never explore whether or not it's true. An example of bias, it happens all the time in science. One really good example of bias in action. Yeah, no, it's okay, Randy. They just got to see your back end, that's all. So one of the really good examples of bias is actually towards scripture. If you read Genesis 1, verse 3, where it says, and God said, let there be light. And then you read a couple of verses later, and you realize that, and that was on day 1. You read a couple of verses later, and you realize, day 4 is when the sun, the moon, and the stars are created. How could that be? Well, modern science will tell you, yes, I know, at least you weren't naked. That would have been a picture, right? Different kind of OnlyFans there. You're going to pay me to block that out. Just kidding. Oh, I love you, baby. It would have been terrible of me. But at any rate, you know, so modern science will tell you that obviously scripture is not true because those two things can't happen, can't coincide, right? You can't have light before you have the sun, the moon, and stars. Except quantum physics proves that photons, which are nothing but light, are part of what power the electrons and the photons and the neutrons that make up the particles that cause suns, moon, and stars to glow. Light does come before the sun, the moon, and stars. But because our bias was set on scripture being wrong, people aren't connecting those dots, even though it's spelled out all over the place. And there's really no contradiction. In fact, you know, when I started learning to do game development, that is when Genesis 1 came alive for me in a way it never had before. And I began taking a whole lot closer look at it. And here's why. It might sound strange that game development would lead me down this rabbit hole, but it did. This is the benefit of being a creative, right? You connect the dots between things that other people just don't. So, as a developer, you have cycles of development where you're putting together small pieces of the code and you're testing it to make sure it runs right before you build the next piece of code that relies on that. So every piece of code is like stacked on top of each other, and every development cycle you have a test run to make sure it all works. Because 9 times out of 10, you're going to find some bugs that you need to squash. Well, when I started looking at Genesis 1 through that lens, suddenly I thought, this reads a whole lot like a developer's log, where he's setting in motion a piece of a program and then testing it and says that is good. And then he goes on to the next. And it's done in the same logical order that I built game worlds. In fact, one of the things that I studied was procedural terrain development. Now, procedural terrain is where you programmatically create a planet, its ecosystem, trees, animals, the whole thing, right? And you can even create sliders that allow you to erode the terrain or, things like that, right? So all of a sudden I realized that we had proven through game development how Genesis 1 could be. In game development, you also do prototyping. So one of the arguments that people often have with Genesis 1 is, well, the earth comes before the sun, the moon, and the stars, and that doesn't make any logical sense because the earth isn't the center of the universe. But that may betray more of a lack of insight into what God was getting at than it does into the probabilities of how things came to be. Because in a game development, you would prototype your basic model that you want to build first, and then you would clone that model, and you would take and remove from it everything you don't need to build your other stuff. So, like, for instance, Earth may have been a prototype that he then took and built the sun and tweaked its variables to create its, and the stars based on the sun, and the moon based on, all of this stuff. So suddenly it looked to me very much like I was looking at a game development log. And so then day 7 makes a lot more sense too. Because what you would do as a game developer is on day 7, after you've put everything into the game that you wanted to put there, what do? You take a break from coding and you go play your game. So the day of rest isn't God doing nothing. It's God stepping into his creation and enjoying it. And creating man and woman last makes complete and total sense because realistically, they're his basically AI caregivers of the whole system. They're the ones who are supposed to be taking care of everything. So, as I said, creativity gives you a whole different way of looking at the same situation that everybody else has been looking at and seeing things that nobody else did, finding patterns where nobody else saw them. And that doesn't mean you're wrong. That doesn't mean that because nobody else saw them, those patterns don't exist. It just means you're seeing something nobody else is. So I thought that maybe we're too quick to label people crazy because their experiences don't match our own. And maybe, and that's why, one of the reasons, I'll bring this back around to you, Malachi. So part of what I did for you, in addition to creating the artwork that I gave you, is create a little book which contains the art, the designs, and some poetry, so that it would be an additional offering you could make to people who wanted it. And it's called the Mad Hatter's Invitation, because his invitation is, maybe try looking at the world through my eyes. Maybe it's not as crazy as you think in here. We're all a little mad around here, right? So it's one of the fun things about humanity, is that we're all unique, and that's both good and it's problematic. It's good in that we all have our own experiences to offer, and it's problematic and creates the probability of conflict because none of us can see things exactly the way the other person does. None of us can bring to even the same image. We can both look at a can of Coke, and because the amount of rods, cones in my eyes and the shape of my eyeball do not match yours, I will not see that can of Coke exactly the way you do. And that that makes life more difficult for everybody. It makes it harder for us to get along. It makes it so that we have to slow down and do more to listen to one another, and to be willing to set aside our own perspective and our own point of view, to empathize with the other person's point of view and try to understand what they're seeing, because each of us has a fraction of the truth to offer one another. Reminds me of that old, I guess, wives' tale, if you would, about these gurus, and they're all blind gurus. They're all surrounding this elephant, and they've all got a piece of the elephant. But because the piece of the elephant they're holding is different, what they feel, what they can sense, what they smell of that piece is different than the other person's. So like one of them has the tail, and he says it feels very ropey, and it's got these brush-like textures to them. And then one of them is holding his trunk, and he says, no, it's moist and it's flexible and it's not at all like a rope. And another one has a front leg, and he's like, no, you guys are all wrong. It's very firm and very solid and very wide. And another guy's like, no, because he's got the belly, right? So, it depends on where you're standing as to what you would experience when you're touching that elephant. And that's one of the reasons why art is so important to society, and why teaching art is especially important. Because in order to be good at art, you actually have to let go of your assumptions about what it is you're seeing in front of you, and draw only exactly what you see. Like, for instance, if I draw a chair, I know for a fact that a chair has 4 legs, that the 4 legs are exactly even, that it has a flat base and a horizontal base that is flat, and a vertical base that may curve slightly to fit the shape of the back. And I know for a fact that that is what a chair is made of. But if I try to draw that, it will look like spaghetti. It will make no sense whatsoever. In order to draw the chair with any accuracy, I have to let go of what I know about to be true about the chair, and draw only what my eyes can see. And that means that it may appear to have 3 legs instead of 4, depending on where I'm standing. The seat may appear to be tilted. The legs there may appear to be 4 legs, but they may appear to be of all different heights. If I want to draw the chair with accuracy, I can't connect to what I actually know is true. I have to connect to only what I see. And my perspective is skewed. It's not reality, it is a distorted view of reality. Yeah, exactly. It's like if we were to look at the same cloud in the sky, we'd both see something different other than what other than that it's a cloud. Yes, exactly, Malachi. Exactly. Our eyes do not perceive things accurately. Our brains do not receive truth fully. St. Paul says it quite well, that we perceive things as through a veil, and we won't see things fully until we get to the other side. So when we're approaching somebody else who says something that sounds crazy, that's not time to dismiss them as, oh, they're crazy. That's time to say, what have you encountered that I haven't? And some discernment is necessary. There may be people who are legit crazy and you shouldn't listen to them. There are people who are deceivers and you definitely shouldn't listen to them. But nonetheless, if we would spend more time listening to try and understand where people are coming from, empathizing with their position, asking relevant questions to make sure we've got the gist of it, and then deciding what we should do in response to that, well, our society would get a lot better in a hurry. People would feel, yeah, exactly. You would see a dragon. I might see a lion or a tiger. That's true, Malachi. It's very true. What we see in the clouds is largely dependent on our brains and what our experiences are, and we find patterns in them that may or may not be real, right? But they're all based on our own experience. And so you may not have had an experience. Could you see, for instance, if you had never seen a panda bear, you're unlikely to see a panda bear in a cloud. And so if I told you that I see a panda bear in that cloud, you'd be over there going, what do you mean a panda bear? What the heck? How do you see a panda bear there? I see a polar bear, maybe. And, so, or maybe you don't even see a bear. Maybe you see a bunch of cotton candy. My husband, he has trouble seeing anything at all in the clouds. So, not everybody can. It is largely tied to your visual creativity. But I don't mean to be rambling on and on and on. But I think that society is the way it is because we want to shut people down, and this is part of our brain's functionality, is that we like to label things. We like to stick label on things because that makes it easier for us to process, and we can then slam them with a label, assume that we understand them, and dismiss them. But labels are good for spice jars, condiments, and filing cabinets. When it comes to people, labels just really don't deal with the complexity of human beings very well at all. People are way too complex for a single label to fit. Yeah, you might search for the panda. Well, that's wise, actually, if you can at least try to search for the panda or ask them for a description of what does a panda look like, right? What am I looking at? I just realized you are seeing unicorn butt in the picture. That purple blob in the background is the hind end of a unicorn. Hold on, let me get her. Welcome to the stream. This is Glitter. Hello, Glitter. 3 years in a row. The year before my granddaughter, the year my granddaughter was born, the year after she was born, and the year after that. Each year they had a bin full of unicorns, and we would pick one out and buy one because they were pretty cheap, $15. So we have 3 of these giant unicorns around the house. When Mia was little, the unicorn was bigger than she was. And so they actually functioned as a baby gate. She was too afraid of the unicorn to even try and cross anywhere it was. By the time she got to be about 18 months old, yay, say hi, woo, unicorn party. Anyway, by the time she got to be about 18 months old, she decided she was done being afraid and she would start trying to climb over the unicorn. And then by the time she was 2 years old, she would just pick those unicorns up, even though they were bigger than she, and drag them all over the house. It was the cutest thing. Now, we don't have room for more giant unicorns, and they've gone up significantly in price, so we won't be buying one this year, but they have come with us to every move we had made since we've gotten them. And it all started, hold on, let me go get the other one. This unicorn is Sparkles. You can tell she's a little faded in her eye, but she is the original. We got her the Valentine's Day before Mia was born, and I'll tell you the story of it because it's pretty adorable, actually. We were low on money. I had a trip to London to go to, and I was down to our last $100, and I still needed to buy some things for the trip. So we went to Walmart, and I was super stressed about the trip and super stressed about finances. And we walked by this bin of these giant unicorns, and my husband pulls one out, this one, as a matter of fact, and he's like, we should get this. Now, I have wanted a unicorn since I was 4 years old. But I'm like, we can't afford $15 extra. I've only got $100 as it is. We can't afford $15 extra. And he looks me in the eyes and he says, put the unicorn in the shopping cart. So I reluctantly put the unicorn in the shopping cart. But then I'm feeling guilty, and I'm about to put her back in the bin. We pass by it again, and he's like, no, let's go check out, get the unicorn. And that became part of the speech that I gave, was how often we say no to our dreams because we don't think we can afford them. We say no to our dreams because we think they're frivolous. Well, Sparkles proved to be pretty good luck that year. That year, not only did I get to go to London and have that speaking engagement, I became an international speaker. I won an award for creative strategy at that speech. I also ended up buying a car that year when it seemed like it was so impossible. Mia Jane, she was a miracle baby. She was not supposed to be born in March. She was supposed to be born around the middle of April. March 4th, her mother gets this horrible anxiety attack. It's awful. To the point where she calls her OB-GYN
And the woman tells her, come in for an appointment. Let me check you out. So Marissa came in for her appointment, got checked out. She wasn't supposed to be having an appointment until that Friday. So this was like Tuesday that she has the appointment. She gets the appointment on the emergency. They check her out. They send her over to the emergency room. And the doctor at first was going to induce labor, even though Mia was 6 weeks early. She was going to induce labor, let Marissa have the baby naturally. But at the last minute, something in her instincts told her, no, we need to do a C-section. Had they not have done that, Mia had her cord tied around her neck in a perfect bow. She would have strangled to death during a natural birth. We would have lost the baby. Maybe lost the mother. And Mia, such a trooper. She only spent 4 hours in the NICU. Here she is 6 weeks early, but she's doing fine. And she's like, look, I am out of here. You guys, the other babies, you are too noisy for me. I'm gone. So she only spent 4 hours in the NICU. And healthy as a little lamb. And fortunately, she was born when she was, because the COVID lockdowns came that next week, and I would not have been able to go see her in the hospital. A lot of other things. They probably wouldn't have given her an emergency appointment. The ORs would have been full. The ER would have been full. So there were a lot of things that just had to come together in order for Mia to actually be born and be healthy. And I thank God every day that they all came together the way they did. That little girl is a walking miracle. So Mia was born nice and healthy on March 5th of 2020. That July, I ended up getting, that May, I ended up getting a contract gig with a major Silicon Valley company. And I ended up making $10,000 for copywriting for them for a few months. And I was able to buy a vehicle for us and the computers that we have now. That whole year, and a lot of people struggled with the lockdowns and everything. And we were blessed to be in a position where we didn't have that. We both worked from home. We were able to keep our income going. We actually thrived during the lockdowns, whereas a lot of people didn't. So Sparkles proved to be very lucky. Really glad I picked her up. A lot of things changed for the better in our life once we got her. But it's proof positive that when your dreams come along and you have the chance to, say yes to them. Speaking of which, if you have not yet participated in my Clarity Challenge, my 5-day Clarity Challenge, it is designed to help you get clear on what your dreams are and start taking your first steps in that direction. I will pop a link to it in the chat. Do feel free to sign up. It costs absolutely nothing, because that's just how I roll. But yeah. Your son had stuffed animals that were way bigger than he was, and when he used to carry around, it would look completely hilarious to watch. Yes, that is one of the hilarious things, is watching a baby carry around a stuffed animal that is like twice their size, just drag it all over the kingdom come. Well, I have talked y'all's ear off for an hour and a half now. Hopefully it's been a decent conversation, at least worth the hour and a half worth of time you have invested in being here. And, woo! I am really grateful that you have come, that you have stayed in the chat, that you've hung out and chatted with me, and we will get this show on the road. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and call it a stream. I hope that you have a very blessed evening.
And hopefully, you know, we'll be here for real talk next week.